Emily Rivers was just 16 when she vanished after Sunday Mass, and Father Damien Calloway, the town's most trusted priest, was the last person to see her alive. In the quiet town of Bellridge, their names were once whispered in separate circles, hers with innocence, his with reverence. But when Emily's body was found buried beneath a shroud of church linens, and Damien's corpse surfaced days later in a river clutching a crucifix, the truth that unraveled would shatter everything the town believed about faith, trust, and the darkness that hides behind the altar. What really happened between a priest and the girl no one saw slipping away until it was too late. The town of Bellridge sat quietly between two low ridges, surrounded by thick pine forests and winding country roads. With a population just under 3,000, it was the kind of place where people recognized each other by the sound of their footsteps. The streets were narrow and clean. The air often smelled of burning wood and fresh rain, and life followed a slow, predictable rhythm. You could stand at the edge of Main Street and see the bell tower of St. Augustine Church, rising above the rooftops like a watchful eye. It had stood there for over 100 years, tall, weather-worn, and sacred. People in Bellridge didn't talk much about secrets. They waved at their neighbors, kept their lawns neat, and trusted each other without hesitation. Especially Father Damien Calloway. He had been the priest at St. Augustine for over a decade. Arriving after his ordination in the city, he was soft-spoken, polite, and known for his sermons that could bring a room to complete silence. Every Sunday, families filled the pews, heads bowed, hearts open. He led funerals, baptized children, visited the sick, and offered kind words to the grieving. Over time, people stopped seeing him as just a man. He became something more, a fixture, a moral compass, someone who, by his very presence, made you feel safe. But safety can be a powerful illusion. Few noticed how little anyone actually knew about Damien's life outside of church. He never spoke about his family. No one recalled ever seeing him with friends or visiting relatives. He lived alone in the modest rectory next to the chapel, his curtains always drawn, his lights dim after dark. He kept to himself, and in Bellridge that was often seen as modesty, not secrecy. Still, there were small things, things that seemed ordinary on their own, but unusual when considered together. The way he would sometimes disappear after Mass, walking into the woods behind the church. The fact that the confessional room remained locked when not in use. The faint smell of wax and incense that seemed to follow him wherever he went. To outsiders, Bellridge looked idyllic, but to those who lived there long enough, the town felt a bit too still, like something was being held. It was in the quiet spaces, the gaps between whispers and glances, that discomfort lingered. And no one embodied that quiet discomfort more than Damien Calloway. Some parishioners claimed they saw him praying late at night in the sanctuary, long after everyone had gone home. Others said they occasionally heard strange muffled sounds coming from the lower levels of the church. Old pipes, they reasoned, nothing more. No one thought to question why Damien kept the church keys with him at all times, or why he never let the cleaning staff into certain parts of the building. He was the priest, a man of God, and in Bellridge, that was reason enough to trust without question. But the cracks were already forming. 2 years before everything unraveled, the church had quietly sealed off a storage wing due to foundation concerns. When a curious maintenance worker asked about reopening it, he was transferred to another parish. A family once donated stained glass windows that were never installed. They were sent back without explanation. These events were dismissed, forgotten, buried under layers of everyday life. But they were the first signs, subtle warnings that something inside St. Augustine wasn't right. No one could have guessed what was really happening. Not that. People who now look back often wonder if there was a moment, a single moment, when things could have been stopped, when someone could have asked a question, knocked on a locked door, or looked deeper into those darkened hallways. But in Bellridge, silence was part of the charm. And silence, as it would turn out, was also what allowed the horror to begin. Emily Rivers arrived in Bellridge on a gray afternoon in late September, her suitcase dragging behind her like a burden too heavy for someone her age. She had just turned 16 but carried herself like someone much older. Her mother, Caroline, had chosen Bellridge to escape a painful divorce, and the constant reminders of a life that no longer existed. She wanted peace, simplicity, a fresh, the kind of town where no one asked too many questions. Emily didn't argue. She didn't argue much about anything anymore, but from the first moment she stepped off the bus, something about Bellridge made her uneasy. The silence, the stillness, the way people stared just a little too long before smiling. They moved into a small house at the edge of town, one with peeling paint and a yard overrun with weeds. Caroline spent her days cleaning, painting, trying to make the place feel like home. Emily kept to herself. She enrolled in the local high school, a small building with faded lockers, and the smell of floor polish lingering in the halls. She was quiet in class, distant with other students, polite but detached. She ate lunch alone. Teachers described her as well-behaved but withdrawn. Her eyes were always watching, observing more than she spoke, listening without reacting. Caroline encouraged her to get involved, to make friends, to try something new. That's when she suggested attending St. Augustine Church. It was where most of the town gathered on Sundays, a place that offered belonging. Emily agreed, without much thought. The next morning, they walked together up the stone steps of the church. The building loomed large, older than anything Emily had ever seen in the city. The stained glass glowed dully in the overcast light. The heavy wooden doors creaked open like a warning. Inside, the air was thick with incense. Everything was too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like someone is watching. Father Damien Calloway greeted them at the entrance. He smiled kindly, shook Caroline's hand, and then turned to Emily. His eyes lingered a second too long. Later, Caroline would describe it as nothing more than a polite greeting, but something about the way he looked at her daughter made her stomach twitch. Damien welcomed them warmly, inviting Emily to participate in the church's youth program. She nodded, unsure of what she was agreeing to. Within a week, Emily was spending several hours each day at the church. She helped with charity drives, folded bulletins, and organized books in the old library. Damien praised her dedication and encouraged her to come early, to stay late. He said she had a quiet spirit, something special. Emily began to smile more around him. She felt seen in a way she hadn't felt in months. He listened to her, asked about her interests, her fears, her past, and slowly her walls began to fall. Caroline noticed the change. At first she was relieved. Her daughter seemed lighter, more at ease. But then she started to notice other things. Emily was secretive about her schedule. She would get texts late at night and hide the screen. She started sleeping with her phone under her pillow. One afternoon, Caroline found her daughter's school books untouched, homework undone. When she asked why, Emily brushed it off with a shrug. "I'm just tired," she said. But Caroline had seen those tired eyes before, when Emily's father started staying out late, when lies first replaced comfort. The more time Emily spent at the church, the more distant she became at home. Her bedroom door stayed locked. She stopped going out with classmates. Even her appearance changed. She began dressing more modestly, covering her neck and arms even in warm weather. Caroline's unease grew, but each time she voiced her concern, she was met with reassurance. "Father Damien's been so helpful," she was told by teachers and neighbors. "She's finally adjusting." But Caroline could sense something else, something beneath the surface that no one else wanted to see. And still Emily returned to the church, again and again, drawn in by something she couldn't name, something that felt safe but wasn't, something that seemed holy but wasn't. Whatever it was pulling her deeper every day, and no one, least of all, Caroline, knew just how far it would go. By the middle of November, the days in Bellridge grew shorter, and the church stood cloaked in long, creeping shadows. Emily Rivers had become a familiar presence within its walls, yet there was something about her visits that felt less like devotion and more like surrender. She no longer came only during youth activities or scheduled services. Now she appeared at odd hours, early in the mornings before sunrise, and sometimes in the evening after the bells had already tolled. The staff grew used to her quiet footsteps, her pale figure moving like a ghost between the pews and the hallways. Father Damien said she was finding spiritual comfort. He praised her commitment, her soul-searching. Others accepted. No one wanted to question the priest's motives, not in a town like Bellridge. But if anyone had taken a closer look, they would have noticed how she always entered through the side door, the one near the vestry that was rarely used by the congregation. They would have noticed how she left without speaking to anyone, head down, lips sealed. At school, Emily was barely present. Her teachers noticed the shift. Her notebooks remained blank, her once detailed assignments reduced to a few disjointed sentences. One teacher attempted to speak to her after class, concerned about her lack of focus. Emily apologized, eyes downcast, voice barely audible. She promised to catch up. She never did. By the end of the week, she had stopped coming altogether. Caroline was told she'd been marked absent for 4 straight days. That was the first time she confronted her daughter directly. Emily didn't respond with anger, only silence. She listened, nodded occasionally, then closed the door to her room and didn't come out for hours. That night, Caroline stood outside her door, listening to the soft buzz of a conversation behind it, her daughter speaking in a hushed voice to someone over the phone. She leaned closer, trying to catch the words. Only one name came through clearly, Damien. The name clung to her like cold air. She tried to sleep but couldn't. The next morning she stood in the kitchen, clutching her coffee mug as if it might stop her hands from shaking. She knew something wasn't right, but she didn't know what to do. Bellridge was not the kind of town where you accused a priest of impropriety. Still, she called the sheriff's office. Sheriff Michael Hart had been in law enforcement for over 20 years, the last 10 of them in Bellridge. He was calm, methodical, and well-liked. When Caroline voiced her suspicions, he didn't dismiss her, but he didn't act either. "We don't have evidence," he said gently. "And Father Damien's reputation, well, he's a respected man." Caroline could feel the unspoken words behind the ones he said. This kind of accusation wasn't welcome here. Still, Hart promised to look into it. He asked around discreetly, spoke to a few people at the church. They all told the same story. Father Damien was trustworthy. Father Damien was incapable of anything improper, yet something in Hart's gut said otherwise. He drove by the church one evening, and saw the lights still on in Damien's office, long past closing time. A silhouette moved behind the curtain, then another. That same night, Caroline searched Emily's room while she was in the shower. She didn't find much, just some folded notes in a shoebox beneath the bed. They were written in neat handwriting, filled with scripture, poetry, and strange phrases like "You're chosen," and "No one understands what we have." The letters weren't signed, but she didn't need a name to know who had written them. Caroline held the papers to her chest, trembling. She felt like she was staring at something poisonous, something that had been allowed to grow unchecked. She wanted to confront Damien, to march into the church and demand answers, but instead she locked herself in her bedroom and wept. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside the church, Emily was still there alone with a man who wore holiness like a mask. The walls that once gave comfort were now holding in a secret, and no one was ready for the price of finding out what it really was. It was a cold, brittle Sunday morning when everything changed. The streets of Bellridge were dusted with frost, and a thin fog curled through the trees like smoke. Caroline Rivers stood in her living room staring at the clock. It was nearly noon. Church had ended over an hour ago, and Emily hadn't returned. She had left early that morning, just after dawn, saying only that she was going to help Father Damien prepare for the service. She hadn't taken her coat. At first, Caroline tried not to panic. Maybe Emily had stayed behind to help clean up. Maybe she had gone for a walk or to the library. But something didn't feel right. Her daughter's absence wasn't like other teenagers sneaking off. It felt heavy, silent, deliberate. By 1 p.m. Caroline was calling the church. No answer. She called again, and again, still nothing. Finally, she drove there herself. The front doors of St. Augustine were open, the sanctuary dark and empty. Candles burned low on the altar, the wax pooling like blood on the white cloth. The silence inside was overwhelming, almost suffocating. She walked through the aisles, calling her daughter's name in a low whisper. No one responded. She checked the side rooms, the vestry, even the back hallways. Everything was quiet, too quiet. It felt like something sacred had been emptied out, leaving only the shell behind. Father Damien was nowhere to be seen. Caroline called the sheriff's office. Sheriff Hart arrived 20 minutes later with a deputy and a flashlight. He searched the church carefully, his footsteps echoing through the halls. Caroline waited near the altar, her hands clenched so tightly they turned white. She tried to convince herself that this was all just a misunderstanding, that Emily would walk in at any moment with an apology and an explanation, but deep down, she already knew that wasn't going to happen. In the small storage room behind the church library, Hart found a folded hoodie, Emily's. It was damp with something that looked like water or sweat, or something worse. Next to it, half hidden beneath a stack of old hymnals, was Emily's phone. The battery was nearly dead, but the screen lit up when Hart pressed the power button. There were dozens of missed texts from Caroline, but it was the last message that made his pulse quicken. He said we'd be together forever. Hart locked the church down and called for backup. Volunteers began scouring the surrounding woods. Flyers were printed, search dogs were brought in. The town, once calm and sleepy, was suddenly gripped by fear. Emily's face was on every bulletin board, every telephone pole, every diner window. People gathered in hushed groups, murmuring theories and prayers, but no one mentioned Damien out loud. Not yet. He wasn't answering his phone. His car was gone. His apartment in the rectory looked recently used, bed unmade, dishes in the sink, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into the mist with her. And with each hour that passed, the hope that Emily had run away or gotten lost began to rot into something darker. Hart reviewed the church's old blueprints and discovered that several rooms, now sealed or forgotten, had once connected to lower storage areas and maintenance tunnels. He called for a team to begin excavation. Caroline, pale and exhausted, stood beside him when they pried open a hatch beneath the altar floor. It led to a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air down there was damp and old, filled with mildew and something else. What they found was not a body, not yet, but the discovery chilled every person in that room. A wooden chest. Inside, layers of church linens, small bottles of oil, a broken rosary, and beneath it all a notebook. Emily's journal. The last pages were torn and frayed, but legible. She wrote of fear, of being watched even when alone, of promises made in whispers. The final entry was dated 3 days before she vanished. I can't breathe in here. I don't know if he loves me or owns me. I think he wants to keep me forever. Hart stared at the words for a long time. Then he closed the book, stood in the flickering flashlight glow and whispered to himself, "This isn't just a missing person case anymore." The hidden cellar beneath St. Augustine was unlike anything Sheriff Michael Hart had ever seen in his years of police. It wasn't listed on any official blueprints, and had clearly been untouched for decades. At least, that's what it was meant to look like. But the air inside told another story. It wasn't stale with time, but thick with something recent. Candle smoke, damp wood, and something far more unsettling, like copper and rot. The steps creaked as they descended, each one groaning beneath their boots, like a warning. The narrow passage opened into a room no larger than a janitor's closet. The walls were made of stone, stained and cracked in places, and there were melted candle stubs, arranged in a strange, almost ritualistic circle around a low table. Atop the table were several notebooks, worn, water-stained, but carefully stacked. Emily's handwriting was immediately recognizable from the journal they'd already found upstairs. These appeared to be earlier entries, less frantic, more romantic. They told the story of how it began, how he made her feel special, how she believed she had been chosen by God. She wrote about a covenant, about something called a sacred union. The further they read, the more it sounded like indoctrination disguised as affection, grooming masked as devotion. The room wasn't just a hideout, it was a shrine, and the most disturbing part wasn't what they found, but what they didn't. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no personal belongings, aside from the journals, no trace of Emily's physical presence, only her word. But behind the stacked notebooks, Hart noticed something odd, a groove in the stone wall, faint but purposeful. He pressed it gently and a small panel shifted, revealing a narrow gap. Inside was a box, not wood but metal, rusted on the outside and sealed with a simple latch. The sheriff hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a bundle of letters, handwritten, addressed to no one, signed only with a symbol, a cross drawn through a circle. Each letter was filled with confessions, declarations of love, and disturbing promises. One read, "Her soul is untainted. I have saved her from a world of sin. She belongs to me now, forever." Another, "If they try to take her away, they will face the wrath of judgment. Sheriff Hart felt his stomach knot. The tone was obsessive, possessive, and deeply delusional. This wasn't a case of inappropriate affection, it was something else, a delusion so consuming it had reshaped reality for Father Damien. Hart closed the box and radioed for a forensic team. The cellar was now considered a crime scene. They sealed it off and began combing the church grounds, now with renewed urgency. 2 days later, Damien's car was found abandoned in a gravel pull-off, near the edge of town, close to an old hunting trail that led deep into the woods. The keys were still in the ignition. A Bible sat on the passenger seat, open to a verse underlined in red ink. For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest, nor is anything secret that will not be known and come to light. Luke 8:17. There were no fingerprints on the cover, no signs of a struggle, just the cold, still car and the silent trees watching overhead. The search intensified. Volunteers from town scoured the surrounding forest, calling Emily's name, looking for any sign of her. Drones were deployed. Search dogs picked up traces of both Emily and Damien's scents, but they faded quickly, almost as if the two had walked into the woods and vanished into thin air. It was on the 7th day that one of the deputies returned to the church alone to retrieve more evidence bag. Passing by the confession booth, he noticed something strange, a sharp metallic smell. He pushed open the wooden door and stopped cold. There, etched into the back wall of the booth, were fresh carvings, lines, crosses, strange shapes that hadn't been there before. And scrawled beneath them, in what looked like dried blood, were 3 words: "She is mine." Hart arrived minutes later. They photographed the carvings, sent samples to the lab, but there was no denying it. Father Damien hadn't just disappeared, he was planning something, and whatever it wasn't over, not yet. The discovery of the message inside the confession booth marked a chilling new turn in the investigation. "She is mine." Those 3 words, smeared in what testing later confirmed to be human blood, seemed less like a statement, and more like a declaration, an omen carved with finality. Sheriff Hart knew this wasn't just the work of a disturbed man who had snapped. This was obsession, calculated and patient. Damien Calloway had been planning something far beyond what anyone in Bellridge could have imagined. The town's atmosphere shifted overnight. Church services were cancelled indefinitely. Parents kept their children home. Once trusting neighbors began looking over their shoulder. What had been dismissed as paranoia only weeks earlier now seemed like long overdue caution. Still, despite the fear, Emily was nowhere to be found. The more they searched, the more elusive both she and Damien became, like phantoms drifting just beyond reach. Forensic analysts had combed the entire church, the rectory, and the surrounding property. They found disturbing drawings in Damien's personal journals, sketches of Emily with angel wings, surrounded by Latin phrases twisted from scripture. One entry read, "When the world rejects purity, it must be hidden, sealed, made eternal." Another included a date, November 3rd, the day she vanished. It wasn't long before the search area expanded. Hart issued alerts to law enforcement in neighboring counties. Damien's face appeared on television for the first time, not as a priest, but as a fugitive. The contrast was jarring. Bellridge's beloved spiritual leader now stared back from wanted posters with dead, emotionless eyes, a predator cloaked in robes. Then on the 12th day of the investigation, everything changed. A call came in from a hunter who had been tracking deer through the dense forest west of town. He had stumbled across something strange near a riverbend, earth, that looked recently disturbed, half covered by fallen leaves. At first, he thought it was an animal grave, then he saw the edge of a white cloth poking through the soil. He didn't touch anything, he just ran. Sheriff Hart arrived on the scene within the hour, accompanied by forensics and a coroner. The site was quiet, surrounded by trees so tall they blocked out most of the sky. The grave was shallow, no more than 2 feet deep. The cloth, once white, was stained with soil and dried blood. As they pulled it back, a terrible stillness fell over the team. It was Emily. She had been wrapped carefully in ceremonial linens from the church. Her eyes were closed, her hands folded over her chest, as though placed in eternal prayer. A cross had been drawn on her forehead in something dark and flaky. The autopsy later confirmed what Hart had already feared: manual strangulation, no defensive wounds, no signs of restraint. She had trusted him until the final moment,
Pinned to the cloth near her heart was a note, written on old church stationery in black ink. It read, "She is saved, I kept my promise." The town of Bellridge fell into a collective state of grief and disbelief. Candlelight vigils were held, the church steps were covered in flowers and notes, many expressing sorrow, others barely containing rage. Emily's funeral was held in a different chapel, one far from St. Augustine. Caroline refused to allow the building where her daughter had suffered to witness her burial. But even in the midst of mourning, one question remained: where was Father Damien? Days later, a breakthrough came when a truck driver reported seeing a man matching Damien's description, walking along a rural highway late at night, wet clothes, limping, no shoes. The sighting led authorities to a riverbank 5 miles from Bellridge. There, floating face down in the shallows, was a body. When they pulled him out, they found a small rusted crucifix clutched tightly in his hand. No signs of trauma, no injuries, just the cold, still corpse of a man whose mind had become a twisted maze of faith, obsession, and delusion. Damien Calloway was dead, but even as his body was loaded into the coroner's van, Sheriff Hart couldn't shake the feeling that something still didn't add up. People like Damien didn't go quietly, and secrets like his didn't die in rivers. They lingered, they waited.
The discovery of Father Damien Calloway's body should have brought closure. His death should have been the final chapter, the end of the horror that had consumed Bellridge. But it didn't feel that way. Not to Sheriff Michael Hart, not to Caroline Rivers, and not to the town that now regarded every shadow, every locked door, with suspicion. Instead of peace, Damien's death raised more questions than it answered. The autopsy revealed no definitive cause of death, no trauma, no water in the lungs. It was as if his body had simply stopped. Officially, the report listed undetermined natural causes. But to Hart, that felt like a cop-out. A man that obsessed, that dangerous, doesn't just lay down and die. The image of Damien lying in that cold water, crucifix in hand, his face twisted into something almost resembling serenity, it stayed with Hart long after the body was buried. There was no funeral, no service, no mourner. His grave was unmarked, his resting place kept secret to prevent desecration. The church officials who had once praised him distanced themselves, quietly wiping his name from church records, sermons and plaques. But the town remembered, and the silence left in his wake was louder than any sermon he'd ever preached. Caroline, meanwhile, refused to speak to the media. Her grief had settled into something far colder than sadness. In her quiet moments, she pored over Emily's journals, letters, even church newsletters, searching for patterns, clues. She began to notice things others had overlooked. Specific verses Damien quoted repeatedly, the same strange symbol, an intersecting cross and circle, etched into corners of pages. The repetition didn't feel random, it felt like a code. She brought the notes to Hart, who had also been nursing his own unease. Together they began to piece together a timeline, something larger than the surface story. They identified dates when other young girls had briefly attended the church and then left town shortly after. Families who claimed their daughters had lost interest, who packed up and moved, almost overnight. Hart reached out to other jurisdictions. Several of those families couldn't be contacted. A few never responded. One mailbox returned a notice. Recipient deceased. A disturbing pattern began to form, one Hart hadn't wanted to see before. Emily may not have been Damien's first victim, she may have been the first they found. Then came the photographs. An anonymous envelope was delivered to the station, no return address, no fingerprint. Inside were 5 photographs, black and white, grainy. They appeared to be taken inside the church basement before it was discovered by authorities. One showed the candle circle around the altar. Another depicted the wall with the carving. But the final photo was the one that made Hart's hands shake. It showed Damien, not the calm, composed priest the town had known, but a man wild-eyed and crouched near the altar, bare-chested, a painted symbol on his back. Standing beside him, in a white robe that looked like an altered communion dress, was a girl. It wasn't Emily. This girl was younger, thinner, her eyes vacant. The photo was dated 3 years prior. Hart stared at the image for a long time, then tucked it into an evidence bag, and locked it away. He didn't tell Caroline about the photograph. Not yet. He didn't know how. The town never heard about the envelope, or the girl. Damien was gone. Emily was buried. The story to most was over. But Hart understood now that what they had uncovered was just one piece of a much darker puzzle, one that had been built slowly, over years right beneath their feet. And although the man responsible was dead, the rituals he created, the ideas he planted, might not have died with him. Something had been set in motion, and in the deepest corners of Bellridge, something, or someone, might still be watching, waiting. Time moved slowly after the death. Bellridge, once a town that prided itself on its peace and predictability, had become a place people drove through but no longer stopped. The windows of St. Augustine Church were boarded up, its doors chained shut by court order. The building sat like a tomb in the center of town, silent, rotting, and cursed by memory. What had once been holy was now avoided. Teenagers dared each other to approach it at night, but few ever did. Those who got close swore they could still hear whispers behind the locked doors, or the faint echo of a bell that hadn't rung since Emily disappeared. Caroline Rivers sold the house within weeks of burying her daughter. She left no forwarding address. Her grief had hollowed her out, and the only thing keeping her tethered to Bellridge had been the hope of justice. With Damien dead, even that hope was gone. Some believed she moved in with relatives in Ohio. Others said she left the country altogether. No one knew for sure, and no one tried to find out. In Bellridge, people had grown comfortable, avoiding the things they didn't understand. Sheriff Hart remained, though he too had he stopped attending town meetings, rarely appeared in uniform, and was seen most often alone, walking the perimeter of the church grounds, or staring down the wooded trail near where Emily's body had been found. His colleagues whispered that he was obsessed, that he couldn't let go. What they didn't know was that Hart had received a second envelope, just 1 month after the first. Inside was a single photograph. This time, it wasn't of the past. It showed the altar room from the hidden cellar, but the items had been rearranged. The candles were new, the linens clean, the circle redrawn, and in the background, only partially visible, was a person hooded, back turned, arms raised. Hart had locked that envelope away too, but the message was clear: someone had been there. After Damien's, the idea that the priest had not acted alone now seemed less like a theory, and more like an uncomfortable truth. There had never been any evidence of another accomplice, no second set of fingerprints, no eyewitness accounts. But what if Damien hadn't needed help? What if he had inspired something bigger than himself? Hart began reviewing all church records from the past 10 years, baptisms, confessions, retreat attendees, volunteers. There was no obvious link, but there were names that returned to him, like echoes: visitors, drifters, temporary workers who had passed through Bellridge and vanished without a trace. Each time he found one, the same unease returned, a sense that Damien's influence hadn't died in that river. It had simply been passed on, like a virus. Then came the most disturbing discovery of all. A construction crew, brought in to assess whether the church could be demolished, found a hidden compartment beneath the choir loft. Inside were relics, more of the strange journals, ritual diagrams, a lock of blonde hair tied with ribbon, and several VHS tapes, labeled only by date. The earliest tape was over a decade old. The latest was from 2 months before Emily's disappearance. Authorities reviewed the tapes privately. What they found was never released to the public. Some who saw them resigned the following day. One officer transferred to another county and refused to speak about it again. Sheriff Hart didn't resign, but he aged 10 years in a week. After that, the church was no longer a question of whether it should be destroyed. It was how soon. They burned it to the ground just after midnight. No ceremony, no announcement, just flames rising high into the dark, like cleansing fire. People watched from their windows, but no one came close. When it was over, only the charred foundation remained. But fire doesn't erase memory, it only hides it in smoke. And somewhere beyond Bellridge, beyond its quiet homes and cracked sidewalks, someone else was holding the final journal. Damien had written. A hand turned its last page slowly. A pen scribbled something in the margins. The story wasn't over, it had only changed hands.